Welcome to the Easton Book Festival. We're so pleased to have biblical reception in folklores of Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas for you, organized by Professor Eric Ziolkowski, who's the Helen H. Manson Professor of Bible at Lafayette College. And I'm going to turn things over to Eric Ziolkowski.
Hi, very happy to be here. I'm really excited about this panel. The session is conducted under the auspices of the 2023 Easton Book Festival. You just saw the director just a moment ago, and Andy Lattis. The sponsorship is Lafayette College here in Easton, Pennsylvania, and also the Greater Easton Development Partnership. The focus of the panel is on the second volume of the Bible in Folklore Worldwide, of which I'm the editor, and to which four terrific panelists are with me here. They're the contributors to some of the essays. The Bible in Folklore Worldwide is a two-volume reference work in the series Handbooks of the Bible and its Reception, published by De Gruyter Press in Berlin. The first volume appeared in 2017, and the second volume is scheduled to be out in the next month. Before proceeding, I do have some words of gratitude to express. First, we're indebted to the multi-talented and exemplarily involved and skilled and creative and productive Andy Lattis, the festival's progenitor and director, and also the co-owner of Book and Puppet Company in downtown Easton. I could go on about what a magnificent contribution Andy and his wife Rebecca and their store in downtown Easton make to the community, but time doesn't permit. But we're immensely grateful in Easton for this festival that he organizes every year. Secondly, I want to thank on the other side of the Atlantic, Albrecht Dernert, the editorial director of the Theology and Religion division of De Gruyter Press, for his unwavering and enthusiastic support of this project from its inception. As the publisher regulates the right of public reading or discussion from this book, it's with Albrecht and De Gruyter's permission, kind permission, that we're able to conduct this panel today. And then thirdly, I want to express my gratitude to all the contributors to the handbook, both the first volume and the second. There have been some unforeseen and long delays in the fruition of this second volume, and the patience of all the contributors to a person has my deep appreciation. But the volume will be out soon. And you see the cover on the screen here. The aim of the handbook is to make at least a modest prolegomenous gesture toward redressing a general, not a complete, but a general neglect or inattention toward the study of biblical influences in folklore. The study of the Bible, biblical studies, is now an old, venerable enterprise, as is the study of folklore or folkloristics. The relative new kid on the block is biblical reception or reception history studies within the broader area of biblical studies. And that's made tremendous strides in recent decades, not the least of which has been the ongoing production of the Encyclopedia of the Bible and its Reception, which is published also by De Gruyter, and in which some of us on the panel are involved in various capacities. But the study of biblical reception still tends to direct its attention mostly, or for a large part, to a large extent, or mostly, toward the way the Bible exerted influences in written literature, art, music, and even dance. But the study of biblical influences in folklore, in particular verbal folklore, remains largely an uncharted, practically limitless territory. over 75 years ago, the famous folklorist Francis Lee Utley characterized biblically derived folk tales as quote unquote uncharted wilderness. And he was right about that. And the situation still holds true largely today. There are lots of reasons why this is the case. Some of these are discussed in the introduction, my introduction to the first volume of the series, the handbook. And I won't go on about that at length. I'll just say that some people have said, for example, Alan Dundas, that there's an ambivalence that people feel towards folklore. It's often associated with error and fallacy. And so when their religious convictions come into play, they don't want to they don't like to think of their religion as associated with error and fallacy. So they want to keep like the Bible and anything to have to do with that separate from folklore. Another factor is Western anthropologists tend to gravitate towards studying quote unquote other cultures and other religions that have no relationship to the Bible and or lack roots in the Bible. That's something that some of the panelists will be talking about today. And that's another reason, why maybe the study of biblical influences in folklore have been neglected. There's also a common bias against associating folklore with written or printed texts. And this bias would naturally, hold people back from thinking about what sort of influences the Bible might have had on folklore. I mean, the Bible, its nickname is scripture, which means, it comes from a word in Latin that means writing or to write. Another factor, it's actually one that Margaret Ziolkowski, my sister in conversation, who's a scholar of Russian literature, she once observed that the impetus towards a lot of folklore collection in the 19th century was nationalist, and people involved in collecting folk tales and assembling them were very interested in it in connection with their nationalist interests, and they very likely disdained Christian folklore because it didn't fit neatly into their nationalistic agendas. And there may have also been a lingering prejudice with regard to the idea that real folklore is overtly ethnic, or you could read that as pagan, quote unquote, in some cases not biblically derived. So there are all kinds of reasons why the field of the study of biblical reception and folklore remains, it's actually it makes it all the more exciting because it remains largely uncharted. And so that's something that this volume is trying to redress. And before going on, I'll just say a few things about how the handbook is arranged. Let's see, this is a map that appears in the front of the first volume, which was a handbook of biblical reception in Jewish, European Christian, and Islamic folklores. And this map, which was prepared by John Clark he works in Stillman Library at Lafayette College. This map just is meant to give an idea of the scope of that particular volume. So it covers Mizrahi, Sephardi, and Ashkenazi Jewish reception, the folklores of various Christian European cultures, Romance languages, Germanic, Nordic or Scandinavian, British and English and Irish, and various East, West, and Southern Slavic, and also Islamic reception. But here, what I've presented here is, these are the content pages. I've put them combine them onto one slide. But this is from the second volume, and you'll see that we cover African samplings from different cultures in different regions of the world. It's kind of a difficult thing because you're dealing with regional categories, but also cultural categories. And so we move from Africa, Southern Asian, Eastern Asian, Chinese, Japanese, then Oceanic, with Fiji and Samoa being the two examples that are focused upon. And then looking at the Americas, we look at indigenous peoples of the Americas, North America, Mesoamerican and Central American, and then North American, African American reception in the folklore of African Americans, and then also the folklore of Latter-day Saints, mostly focusing on the region of the Western United States. Again, no pretense or illusion of anything approaching exhaustiveness. That would be a fool's mission. The idea of this volume and the first are to give focused samplings of the area, hopefully to inspire others to push the field further. I will say that in this volume closes with a look at the way that folkloric elements, biblically influenced, make their way into film. And it's very interesting when you think about it, because film is something that's produced by groups of people. It's not one person who goes out and makes a film, but it's groups. And that kind of mimics the workings of folklore, which is always a communal enterprise that leads to the creation of folklore. And then my closing essay, I wanted just to look at something that's fascinated me for a long time, and I thought it might be interesting to end the handbook with it, and that is the way that some particularly prominent biblical or Bible-related characters, in this case, I look at 4, namely Jesus, Mary, Elijah, and also the wandering Jew, who's not obviously a character from the Bible, but the legend of the wandering Jew is directly related to the Bible and stems from biblical passages. These 4 characters wander in folklore. I mean, they're constantly on the go. They appear, they pop up in different places, literally around the world. And what I'm interested in, the way that mirrors the wandering of the folk tales themselves. Not that all folk tales are migratory, but they do have a tendency to move around. And so I just wanted to explore this connection between characters who wander, but they wander within tales that wander. So that's the closing essay to the volume. The volume here, just a little, you can see a little more closely the content pages from this second volume of the handbook. And then to give an idea of the regionality of this volume, I wanted to include some maps. These are again produced by John Clark, and the maps will appear at the front of each of the essays on the particular region. So, for example, the 2 essays that deal with Africa, focusing in, and indeed Isabella Mukonyora, who's one of our panelists, will be talking about this. You can see that one of the essays focuses on Eastern, kind of Central and Southern Africa, the other on Western Africa. And the maps are important for, they're not supposed to be detailed in any way. I mean, the names that appear on them are places that are mentioned. Mostly they're there because they're mentioned at some point or other in the essays, but they're just to remind the reader of the place, the location, the locative dimension of folklore. Here's the map that will accompany the South Asia essay. the China essay. And there's actually a very interesting allusion, just almost a passing allusion to the Great Wall of China that's linked in a kind of interesting way, actually, with biblical reception in John Lye's essay. And that's why I wanted to include the Great Wall. Plus, the Great Wall is just such a folkloric image that it was something especially wanted to include. Here's the one on Japan. And these maps, by the way, were made in consultation. I worked closely with John on the making of these, the production of these maps, but also the authors were brought in. I can tell you as the editor of this volume that one of the great challenges was actually it deals with so many different languages and questions of whether to include diacritics or not. That haunts the project. But so the terminology and the wording of even the names of some of the places, it was very important to get the authors' input. Now, with the North American maps, it's kind of interesting. You know, you could do this exercise with any place on Earth, but you look at North America, you look at the Americas, and depending on what culture's perspectives you're looking at it from, it can look very different. Again, this is just to give an idea of some of the peoples of the native indigenous American peoples where they're associated with. Of course, some of them have moved at different times and relocated, not always at their by their own will. And then this is the map that will accompany the African American folklore chapter, and we wanted to reflect the movement of African Americans, the great migration of African Americans roughly between 1910 and 1940, somewhat extended up to 1970. But just to give an idea of the movement, I mean, and again, this idea of movement comes out also with this map looking at the same region, but now from the Mormon point of view, the Latter-day Saint point of view, you can see the different movements of, starting with Joseph Smith's The Prophets movement from Sharon, Vermont to Palmyra, where in New York, where he had his visions and where everything started for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But then there are later migrations of the Latter-day Saints to the Midwest. And then, of course, after the assassination of Joseph Smith, the epochal exodus really is how it's interpreted by members of the Latter-day Saints Church, the exodus out west to their promised land in the North American West in the Great Salt Lake Valley. And so again, these maps are there just to give an idea of the place and often the movement. That's another, just I can say as editor, what something striking, a theme that recurs in looking at these folkloric traditions, how often around the world, how often movement, migration, exodus, forced migration is integral to the lives of the peoples who are considered, and it gets reflected in the folklore. And that's one reason why the biblical theme of Exodus is recurrent throughout the volume. It's quite striking. Maybe some of the panelists will say something about that today. So without further ado, I would like to start. I've asked each of the four panelists to speak for about 10 minutes about each of their own contributions to this volume. And then following their presentations, we'll have just an informal discussion for the rest of the time, talking about a certain set of questions that I will have for them. But let's start. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Isabella Mukonyora, Professor of Religion and Theology in the History Department at Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and co-chairperson of the Association for African Study of Religion, the AASR, and editorial board member of the National Theta Alpha Kappa Honors Society. The regional focus of her essay is biblical reception in the folklore of Southern, Eastern, and Central Africa. Bella, I turn it over to you, please.
Thank you very much. It's only 10 minutes, so I'm glad I decided to put that picture behind me of the phenomenon of men, women, and children. We can only see women here with their children because the majority of these folklorist participants are women, led by men, because the general understanding of the scriptures in terms of this oral tradition that they have formed is that men are meant to be there in a kind of leadership role. In this case, they preach, but clearly they do not dominate the phenomenon. Now, this stuff I'm talking about, I'm not the first one to notice it. I only noticed it because after my PhD in Oxford, I was writing so much, arguing things in the English language. It was so refreshing to get back to Zimbabwe, and walking to work, I saw people wandering around into a park by them to the lake and so on nearby the outskirts of the city. So that's how I came across them. Now, because of time, and also I can't put my PowerPoints, I'll just have to describe them. I presented this talk actually before this publication. So we have Matthew Folklores. Is my volume okay?
Yes.
Okay. Matthew Folklores was a professor at the University of Malawi for many years, anthropologist, but also knowledgeable in theology. So he came across this phenomenon of thinking through the idea of folklore. Another scholar is called Richard, mentioned in my book, Richard Weber, and he wrote a book about an article about the wilderness as a biblical imagery of Zion and in Africa, a sort of thing. So people of God who are on a search for meaning, they go in and out of the wilderness, and this is like a dramatization of knowledge, which I've talked about in an earlier publication before this thing came out. So I just thought maybe I was never really gonna be able to talk about it anyway, given where I am. The picture I have next for my PowerPoint is the thirst for the Logos, meaning a thirst for a wisdom, a divine wisdom, where there's a man sitting with a Bible, an old Bible, almost torn because it's been handled, and he's sitting with a stick on the sand to show that what he's trying to communicate is biblical, but the Bible is now just a symbolic tool, like the robes are an expression of Book of Revelations, the children of God dressed in white below the heavens, holding the Bible, making it sit by next to him was the way of expressing a sense of authority in terms of the origination of the folkloric presentation of Christianity that was going on. So I'll just quickly go through. They call themselves the apostles, African apostles, because they see themselves as going back to the roots of Christianity in a context in which the traditional mainline churches operate pretty much along the lines of Western traditions of faith in civilized Western societies with church buildings, car parks, where you tithe and so on. And they want to show that they are going back to the roots of Christianity instead. And the oral roots of Christianity is what they are looking for. When the knowledge as communicated by somebody like Jesus was oral, in that he wandered out into the margins of the city where the poor and the social outcasts were, and he talked about God there. He addressed problems, he communicated with you and touched you, and people started to follow him around. So it is not about with compassion and things that go with what is, to me, the essence of religion, really, whether one is talking about Christianity or other religions, the getting to the roots of things. So they emulate that. So they walk out of their slums and cheap housing, because most of these are either unemployed or they are poor, working in industries and so on, living in townships, and they walk into the wilderness for up to 6 hours on a weekend, Saturday or Sunday, and they will walk together, talk about their problems, pray, and console the children. And I will, just to save time, go to the height of the ritual activities. Someone prays after someone preaches, and if the preacher is too loud, the women will start singing to show that this is a spiritual moment where we are all equal before God, and just express that knowledge through song, speaking to each other, and there is no need for anybody in that context to actually hold the Bible or pretend to be literate. So the way I'm dressed today, I would have to take off this necklace and really look plain and dress in white in order to, and walk barefoot like Moses did in the wilderness. So yes, it's bringing together imagery from the Bible, and what it does is that it works very well, not only to unite the participants, but also get them to have empathy towards each other as strangers. So I was being called, people call me professionally, Professor Bella Mukonyora, but over there, I'm just Mother Bella. And if you are a man, you are Brother Bella or Father Bella. No one is above the other. We only use first names. And what is Christian about this in terms of the belief in ancestors in the background culture is that they renounce the ancestors by simply refusing to use their last names in the context of prayer, where everybody is occupying a sacred space and needing to think only in terms of God, who created the universe and earth, and everything surrounding, therefore becomes also a meaningful expression of the reality of God as an omnipresent being on earth. So he's omnipresent, he reaches everyone. I remember asking one woman, I just wanted to say hello, what does this mean to you? And she just stopped talking. She could see I needed to understand that she was there for herself, and she was gonna listen to the God speak to her heart. And she immediately said, the text, the biblical text, was written in ancient times by people who lived there and then. They were simply trying to put down in words that which they thought, that which meant something to them in their own folkloric expressions of what God meant. So to them there and then. So to him, to her, you can only really listen to God directly. Now, I tend to like questions. How many minutes do I have? Am I almost finished? Oops. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Eric, you're muted.
Yeah, we can hear you well. Sorry, I muted myself.
Oh,
yeah, you have another 5 minutes. Bella.
Oh, okay, good.
Sure.
So I've got many themes, so I was really welcome this opportunity to go into this volume because I needed because I've just been almost talking to myself in every journal, in everywhere I could to try and show that the lived understanding of religion is something you can learn from this kind of folkloric expression of knowledge about God. And there is a book that's been written, and a little booklet that was written by Clive Dillon Malone, showing all the biblical references that make this particular folklore actually work as is. And I needed to study that to understand ideas of gender, and I was fascinated by how women I knew lived with suffering and so on, were so calm, confident, and happy to just be there and not feel that they are under any oppression. Now, what has happened? This is where the problem with technology and modern visualizing things happens with the information technology, is that these Masoe have moved all the way from Zimbabwe into South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, North, and now actually they are found in cities in Europe where they have maybe turned up as refugees, and they become a nuisance. I heard somewhere that they were seen trying to go and do these practice their Christianity outdoors, dressed in white, with no Bibles, and people wondered whether they were Muslims or what was going on with them. And it just explaining what they were doing in another culture becomes very has been awkward in places. But in Northern England, they do that. In London, in the outskirts, they go and they meet and they do it. Now, this is changing the flavor of it because it's almost like dramatizing it for the sake of being known to have this unique tradition around, and it changes the flavor of it from what I was seeing in Africa among people who genuinely just wanted to be outdoors, pray together, talk about life, and calmly have boundaries around which you cannot speak a certain way. So in this case, you only speak the vernacular, you only speak Shona, which is my mother tongue, because that's the only way to fully express this deeper spiritual meaning rather than the English language. So there was a shunning of things Western in terms of dress and cultural expressions of literacy and power and so on, in order to emphasize humility and prayer and equity before God. So I'm sorry, my beautiful pictures I have not have, but I've also been fascinated by the same oral tradition. And I'm glad you mentioned North America, the African-American tradition. I found a picture online, North Carolina, of people dressed in white in a riverbed, and they are baptizing or praying and raising their hands and so on. That's a bit different. Anyway, the context for Africa, I'll just finish with mentioning some of the interesting sources that make it almost incomprehensible that we have this phenomenon, and it's very widespread. And the more we have climate change and problems which no one can really solve for you, I think this movement is going to grow. People will just need to be able to practice their Christian faith in a way in which folklore is a factor. Colonial oppression is well described by Arthur Shirley Cripps. He was an Anglican missionary who had gone to Zimbabwe, and he was already saying, look, much as I want to spread the gospel, the colonial structure by which you force people into small places, you take 75% of their land to build industries and so on, is unbiblical and unchristian, and we shouldn't be surprised that Christianity people will respond in a religious way to this problem of oppression. Terence Ranger is also known. He was an Oxford University professor for describing the economic depression of the 1930s, which is when this movement began. That there was famine, there were people really struggling for survival. Urbanization was going on, but there was no economic structure globally to work with in the 1930s. And strikingly enough, that is when Johane Masowe, a man who adopted the name John from John the Baptist, and so he calls himself Johane Masowe, meaning wilderness, a description of his understanding of stories of Exodus, Jesus walking around among the poor and sick, and John the Baptist, of course, whom he decided to adopt the name in order to avoid the misconception that he was trying to be a Jesus, because most of his behavior, in fact, he never mentions the name Jesus. He just wants the message to come across in an oral way through his dramatization of biblical stories that tie together, and removing shoes, and he also gives his story. So there is a thing called the Gospel of God, which I don't think anyone reads except academics because of that. So there's plenty of, this is a growing movement now in the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe. So it's be interesting to see what happens then. But it's a little different from up to the stage where scholarship ends. Is that okay?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And maybe when we do the question and answer, the figure of Masawe, of Johann Masawe, is so interesting, and how he's become adopted as a folkloric figure. You know, we might get into some discussion of that. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you so. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, our second speaker, and we're shifting geographically quite radically now. We're going from southern Eastern Africa to Southern Asia, India in particular. Herman Tull. Herman is located in Princeton, New Jersey, and he taught for many years here at Lafayette College, actually, where he was a very popular teacher. And he's going to talk about the biblical reception in, to the extent that there is biblical reception in South Asian folklore. He has will share about his, some reflections about his contribution to this volume. Herman.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It was an interesting project to begin with, and just sort of as an aside to start out a little bit, it's interesting to be in a collection, a book that's a collection. We rarely encounter the other authors in the collection, so it's kind of nice to be here sitting as a chapter with some of the other authors. It's a little bit different experience than the usual sort of never meet the other authors. I had a background, or have a background, primarily in South Asian studies, the study of religion also, and working with Eric Ziolkowski for a couple of years, I got engaged or involved with biblical reception as well. And I had, although most of my work was in classical Indian literature, primarily Sanskrit language. I had also done some folklore studies. But to put them all together into a single essay turned out to be quite a challenge in a lot of different ways. And in fact, the comment that Eric made earlier, that it was an uncharted wilderness, I would say, even having spent now a few years with the work, and it's still uncharted and it's still a wilderness. There's a little bit of insight we get to it. Anyway, I don't want to focus too much on problems, but looking at something like biblical reception, folklore, South Asia, the three things together, there's a lot that has to be defined right from the beginning. And the first question is, what is South Asia? My interest is primarily India. I primarily know India, but Eric showed the maps earlier, and this was in fact the first question: is what are we talking about? But turns out today the United Nations views Southern Asia as everything from Iran on the west side through India in the going toward the east and then going toward the south, which finally ends up with Sri Lanka. And what we have there also are three major world religions with hundreds of millions of adherents of those religions. So Hinduism, Buddhism, primarily in Sri Lanka, but Buddhism as a historical relic in India still remains very, very strong. And of course, Islam. So there's a big piece right there. And none of those religions were displaced in any significant way by Christianity. Although there is Christianity and some Judaism that has come into Southern Asia, they were not displaced. So it then becomes a challenge. Well, what are we talking about? How much Bible is there? How did the Bible get there? When did it get there? And there are a few significant moments that we can look at. The first is, of course, the fact that there were travelers who came into India, and there were some established communities. But those established communities, a few Jewish communities, a few Christian communities, in fact, a community that was well established, possibly as early as 100 CE, of two communities, one Christian, one Jewish, in southern India. But those communities, for the most part, their use of the Bible or their experience of the Bible, it didn't spread beyond those communities. It stayed within that community. So that's not a very fruitful source. Where things start to change a little bit is with the incursion of missionaries. And that's really two groups. Around 1500, the Jesuits start to come in. And of course, they bring Bible and they introduce the Bible. But coming from a Catholic tradition, they're less concerned with having people read the Bible than they are with having people understand Bible stories, biblical doctrine, Christian doctrine. And there was no real strong effort to have the Bible spread in and of itself. There were some work toward translating. More importantly, the Jesuits actually absorbed some of Hindu, Buddhist folklore elements and used it, sort of incorporated in ways of telling Bible stories. And I'll get to that in a second. The second way, and really the most significant way that the Bible comes into South Asia, particularly India, are the Protestant missionaries who come starting around 1800, and as a sort of an adjunct to the colonial presence. Although the British colonial presence, they kind of went back and forth whether they really wanted the missionaries or didn't want the missionaries, but like it or not, the missionaries came at that time. And so between 1800 and really maybe the middle of the 19th century, 1850s, 1860s, that presence continued to grow. And the Protestant missionaries, unlike their Catholic predecessors, they were very, very interested in having the Bible spread. Read the word of the Bible, for this was their way of gaining converts, or they thought it would allow them to gain converts. And right from the start, right from 1800 onward, they translated the Bible into as many languages they possibly could. In fact, within 10 years, they had about 40 different Bible translations In fact, the group in India, they're the ones who did the first Chinese Bible as well. So there was a Jesuit version before that, but they actually were working right near Calcutta. So that was a real industry to try and get the Bible. And then they brought the printing press with them and published and published and published. The numbers probably in the millions they had, but who read it, who understood it, it didn't get a lot of traction. It certainly didn't displace any of the Indian classics. And there's a lot of writing that sort of says, well, it's a book. It's a very nice book, but it's not scripture. It's not our scripture. It's fine. And so it certainly wasn't something that you would find in someone's home as a valued artifact in their Bible. But there was plenty of Bible there. So really, we have a situation where Christianity doesn't displace, but Christianity or reading of the Bible, it's there. It works its way into some elements of folklore, but it's a little bit tough in terms of actually really tracking it out. But the other issue also, which this was early on in our discussions of the chapter, and it's in the introduction, what is folklore? And folklore in traditional Western academic understanding is not quite what it is in India. It's not exactly that same sort of, Eric mentioned early on, there was this nationalistic sense of let's define who we are as a people, whether we're German or Russian, by our folkloric traditions. That's not quite how it worked in India, where there are layers of textual traditions, or non-textual. Actually, a lot of it is oral tradition. And scholars who work in India or who think about India tend to define folklore as the broadest level. I said it the wrong way. Actually, it's not the broadest, the opposite of the broadest, the most local level, but broad in sense of the ability to spread easily. Non-textual, which of course makes it very challenging for a scholar trying to find the material, and localized in terms of language. India, of course, has thousands of languages. I mean, the language changes. You can go 30 miles and the language suddenly changes, so much so that it's barely understandable to the group that's 30 miles away. So that was a problem also in approaching this problem. Where is folklore? It's in the eye of the beholder, really. And the folkloric traditions were sort of defined in India, much as they were in Europe, by people who were interested in collecting local traditions. And they were invariably colonialists. They came in, the same view that they had in Europe of let's find a broad-based text. Well, let's find the same sort of thing for India. It'll give us a sense of who these people are. So for the most part, what are we looking at when we try and find those colonial collections? The collections of folklore. They sort of exist barely in a few texts here and there that were collected by Europeans, and every once in a while you get a little bit of Bible knowledge. There's another conflict, and the other conflict that comes up here, and it's a kind of a strange one. The Europeans who were collecting bits and pieces of folklore, they weren't interested in seeing Bible folklore, even though the Bible may have been in place in various parts in various ways in India for hundreds, if not really thousands of years. They viewed it as inauthentic. So then you have another problem. One of the places where this came up is actually the earliest collection of Indian folklore by a woman named Mary Frere. I'll mention her again in a little bit. And she collects folklore from her ayah. An ayah is somewhere between a nanny and a personal servant. And she's got stories of animals, and she's got stories of elephants, and she's got stories of kings, the sort of stuff that would sell in Europe. But in the introduction, there's a little reference to the fact that her ayah is both Christian and Hindu. She identifies as both Christian and Hindu. She's somehow had this, experience of both traditions. And she has some wonderful little bits of folklore in there that get into the introduction, but we don't hear anything else. And one of those, sorry, I had marked it, but it was so wonderful to read it. There we go. Here we go. The ayah talks about a song that she vaguely remembers from her youth, which has the Indian image of a young woman with a pot balanced on her head and a family of monkeys swinging in a tree. So this is this nice little Indic tale. But all of a sudden, into this scene comes the arrival of the 12 apostles, and Jesus Christ of Nazareth. So there's clearly some mixing, and it clearly exists, but the collector here in this case is just simply just doesn't really have an interest in that sort of thing. After this, there are little bits and pieces here and there, and really the place to look to sort of gather folklore after this is some of the missionaries realizing, the Protestant missionaries in particular, realizing that no one was reading the Bible. How are we going to get Bible stories or get the Bible out to the people of India? And they start to draw on elements of Indian culture and kind of create their, realizing also that folklore type stories, or what they've identified as folklore, are extremely popular. So they use the folklore genre or a format of folklore and start to put in their own little biblical elements into these stories. It's a bit of a problem. And one of the problems is folklore in India, the non-biblical folklore, the traditional folklore, the stories tend to be highly eroticized. They like sexy stories. This is a very popular, of course, the missionaries wrote ceaselessly about how awful the stories were. And, but nonetheless, they tried to clean up as best they could. In fact, they cleaned up. They didn't use any of the eroticized elements, and would tell these stories, some of which were recorded. And I mentioned Mary Frere, who wrote the first collection. The other, there was another collection done by a woman, which is important that these were women who were putting these collections together. And she actually wrote a whole series of little stories, which elevated in particular the reading of the Bible, that the Bible itself had a kind of, you could, people led terrible lives until they encountered the Bible, maybe at a fair, or someone that they knew had a Bible. And so that while the elements of the Bible are themselves not included in the folklore focuses on the text itself, that the text has a kind of a magical quality to it. And so that gets into a number of stories also. There again, it's a difficult history to track down, but every once in a while something comes up. Modern India, and I would say, more modern, the figure of Jesus has become a kind of an interesting folklorized figure. There's a series of comic books that are very popular in India. They're called Amar Chitrakatha. The many different stories, it basically means, that translates. And they have the story of the Buddha. They have the story of Vishnu. They have the story of the epic wars. And lo and behold, there is Jesus Christ. The comic book. In fact, I think I have it. Where's my Jesus Christ, the comic book? I thought it was here. I guess it's backwards because of the camera, but these are very, very popular, and along with this kind of folkloristic tale of Jesus, there's also stories of Jesus ending up in Kashmir and being buried in Kashmir. So there are a fair number of stories of Jesus that have worked their way into South Asian folklore. That's one modern instance that you see with some commonality. I'm gonna tie this up with the sort of a last way in which folklore, or the folklore of the Bible, biblical folklore, and the missionaries, and some of these women who collected the stories. Actually, I want to make one more comment about the women, but in modern India, there are universities actually dedicated to the study of folklore. There are departments, there's a few different universities, and it's a little bit of colonialism coming sort of full turn and being incorporated into the Indian academic scene. Now, that folklore, again, very much focuses not on elements of Bible. They wouldn't want to see that at all. They want to see more Indic, but not really thinking about what the roots were in the 1850s, 1860s among these Bible collections. The last point I'll make here, and something very, very interesting in the research and in the writing of the chapter, I mentioned a few times that there were a number of women who were involved. This is the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. There were not a lot of things that women did in those days other than raise children and take care of a household. There was educational opportunities were not available to them. There were no women professors. And so here was a place looking at folklore, which there was a bit of a space. It wasn't really an academic discipline, although their books have persisted. They're still in print. And it wasn't quite an academic discipline. There was a little space here, somewhere between being, and in the case of the two women that whose work I used extensively, one was the daughter of a colonial administrator. So here she is in India, somewhat protected, can do kind of what she wants. She's not in England, she's outside of that. And the other was a woman who went to India late in life as a missionary. And so it's an interesting kind of space that allowed for, say, a different kind of scholarship that wouldn't have been possible. And again, it's because, and this is sort of in tune with the book, folklore sits in a little different place for an academic. It's not quite what we normally work with. It's somewhat elusive, difficult to really grasp, but it has this kind of wonderful quality of being on the edges of things. So,
thank you so much, Herman. And already between you and Bella, I mean, so many different questions have already come up about the challenges of studying folklore in these different places, and particularly the biblical influences, and we'll hopefully can get to that in our later discussion. Our third panelist is John T.P. Lai, who's joining us from Hong Kong, from the other side of the globe, in a very different time zone, and he's professor of the department in the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the focus of his essay in the volume is biblical reception in the folklore of China. So, John, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Eric for inviting me to join this fascinating project and panel today. Yes, today I'd like to just share with you my research on the biblical reception in the Chinese context, with special reference to the Bible in Chinese folkloric traditions during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So Protestant Christianity came to China with this missionary called Robert Morrison, who came to Canton in 1807. And as Herman has just mentioned, the main focus and priority of their missionary work is the translation of the Bible. So actually, with another missionary called William Mill, they produced the first Protestant Bible, full Protestant Bible in Chinese in 1823. In fact, Herman has just mentioned there's another project going on at the same time in Calcutta by the Baptist missionary Marshman, right? And apart from the translating the Bible, actually, they produced and published hundreds of these Christian works in Chinese local dialects. And many of them are fascinating. For example, this particular one actually is a Chinese translation of the Pilgrim's Progress. But you may wonder, there's no Chinese character there, but actually is the Romanized translation in Cantonese, which is my mother tongue, actually. So it's called Tien Lo Lek Tsing, right? So from here, you will wonder, why do they produce Romanized version? Actually, many of these Christian publications, they are meant not to be read privately, but they are kind of transmitted orally in public. So actually, many of the missionaries, they tap into the oral traditions or the folkloric traditions of disseminating the biblical messages or these biblical texts through oral tradition, oral transmission. For example, in the setting of a village reading of these texts. Because many of the Chinese vernacular literature or dramatic texts, actually, they were kind of read aloud or performed in public, in villages, etc. And today, I would like to select 3 fascinating examples of biblical reception and Chinese folklore imagination. The first example I'd like to talk about is the Heavenly Family in Hong Xiuquan's dream vision. So maybe some of you have heard about Hong Xiuquan. Actually, he was the ringleader of a very kind of influential and movement called Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. This is a Christianity-inspired or tainted insurgency with the attempt to topple the last dynasty of China, last imperial kind of regime of China in the mid-19th century, lasting for a decade or two. And actually, they became very successful in occupying large areas and territories in southern part of China, with the capital city in Nanking. And they also published their own version of the Bible called the Taiping Bible. And also they actually published and produced a lot of these Christian works in Chinese. For example, this particular one is a Taiping Trimetrical Classic published in 1853. Interestingly, I'd like to highlight just 2 examples. There are so many references to oral traditions and folkloric traditions of China. For example, it really emphasized the family relations and also female figures in the Taiping heavenly realm. For example, it mentioned there's a huge family of Jesus in the heavenly realm of the Taiping heavenly kingdom. For example, Jesus' wife, so it's mentioned as the heavenly elder sister-in-law, or Jesus' mother, who's the heavenly mother. So all these actually tap into the folkloric traditions of traditional China. For example, I think the Heavenly Mother also echoes the so-called Queen Mother of Heaven, Wang Wu, who was the mother of the Jade Emperor in the heavenly realm, especially in the Taoist heavenly realm. And all these traditions can be seen in some, for example, vernacular literature in China. For example, if you know about the Journey to the West, So the Queen Mother of Heaven or the Jade Emperor are very prominent figures in these folkloric traditions. So actually the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom or the leader Hong Xiuquan, actually they're very familiar with these traditions, folkloric traditions, and try to have these kind of hybrid texts, integrating folkloric elements into their biblical text. The second example, interesting example I'd like to briefly talk about is the image of Jesus in some anti-Christian pamphlets. As we know, Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, came to China against the context of a number of wars, right, or Western kind of colonialism or imperialism, such as the Opium War or the Franco-Chinese War, right, in the 1840s, 1860s. So actually, the anti-Christian sentiments were very widespread and also rampant. That's why there are so many anti-Christian posters circulating in Chinese villages or cities, right? For example, this one, it talks about the crucifixion of a swine, a pig, right? Why is swine? Actually, swine in Chinese is 猪, which is a homophone of 主, 主 meaning Lord. Lord refers to Lord Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ was portrayed or depicted as a swine. So you see there's a swine being crucified and also executed. And there's another very popular anti-Christian pamphlet. It's called Damned, the Demonic Cult, 鬼教该死 in Chinese. Is so kind of popular and widespread in central and southern China in late 19th century. There's a quote I'd like to just read briefly. So from that pamphlet, it says, as a demonic swine reincarnated, Jesus was extremely evil. He was crucified by the old demonic king of Judea. Burned with hatred, King Yama imprisoned Jesus in the hell of darkness and took him out once a day for torture. So here, as I mentioned, swine was normally used to portray Jesus, right? And what's more interesting here is the King Yama. So, as some of you may know, King Yama actually is the lord of the underworld in Chinese folklore traditions and also Chinese mythology. So he is the ruler of the hell or hate. So here, Jesus was imprisoned, tortured, and punished in the underworld by King Yama, just like all these the devils and demons, right, in the underworld. The third example, I think is also equally fascinating, is the revelation of Jesus, not in Christian churches, but in Taoist temples, especially in Taoist planchette writings. As some of you may know, planchette writing was quite popular in the Taoist tradition. It's a kind of spirit writing, getting revelation from some Taoist sages or Taoist immortals. But now, Jesus has become a Taoist immortal or sage. So in a Taoist temple in Shantung province in early 20th century, which is called Daoyuan. So Daoyuan actually advocated the common origin of the 5 religions in China, including Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Islam, and also Christianity. And they argue that all these institutionalized religions actually are partial expressions of the highest deity, which is the venerable patriarch of primordial times. In Chinese, there's a long term called 至圣先天老祖. Okay, so all the leaders of these 5 religions actually are partial expressions of these highest deity, including, of course, Jesus himself as a partial expression. So in this very fascinating record called the Record of the Refined Essence of the Tao and its Virtue, in Chinese is 道德精华录. So Jesus is revealing himself through this Taoist ritual of planchet writing. Okay, so here is that is in a first person narrative. Say, I, the sage Jesus, have received the order from my master, presumably that the highest deity, right, to come to this shrine, this Taoist shrine, and give instructions. As the founder of a religion, Christianity, right, I and my peers visit the profane world, proclaiming the word on behalf of heaven and saving the people for the nation. So I think this is a fascinating record of Jesus revealing himself through the planchet writing of this Taoist ritual, right? So due to limitation of time, I can talk about other very fascinating examples that I've discussed in my chapter. But I think through the 3 examples that I've just briefly mentioned, I think these intriguing and original sources exhibit an extraordinary legacy of the hybridity and heteroglossia of the folkloric traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries. And these in turn reflect the direct or subtle biblical and Christian influences. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John, so much. Really, the 3 of you already, Bella, Herman, and John, you've gotten us off to such a really interesting start. And I mean, really what fascinates me, having read all your essays, and I mean, that was a great pleasure of doing this, is the different ways, the different avenues that each of you have had to develop and chart, you know, for getting at the way that the biblical influences make their presence known in these different traditions. And you've already, the 3 of you have shown you know, demonstrated the variety of ways that this occurs. With our 4th speaker, Crystal Whalen, Crystal has lived for a long time in Japan, in Mongolia as well, in different parts of the world. She's now located in Barre, Massachusetts, and she's going to talk about the biblical reception of folklore in Japan. And I think I can anticipate, knowing her essay, that there's going to be some complementarity with some of what's already gone already been presented in the other essays, but also some, you know, things that are quite unique to the Japanese situation. So, Crystal, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much, all of you. I'm enjoying what I've heard so far, and there are so many similarities, you know, particularly on the Asian front, you know, China being neighbor with Japan. But I wanted to say, first of all, how I got involved in this, because it has a lot to do with my methodology. I really came from a background in Italian and Portuguese, and I was so fascinated by the Portuguese presence in Asia that, and I wondered, why did it turn out so badly in Japan? So that really was the seed in which I began to study Japanese. I grew up in a place where it was pretty commonly spoken, and as a child, I was taken to Buddhist temples, that is Honolulu. So it wasn't such a stretch for me, but I want to talk to you about, you know, so I went to Japan and I had no idea that these hidden Christians, which are the remnant of the early conversions to Christianity. I had no idea that there were still outliers, that they were still continuing a tradition. And so when I found out they existed, I went and I lived on those islands. And so I ended up spending a lot of time in Japan directly with the people. So my situation was, I guess, people first, archives later to some extent. And I didn't know at the time when I lived with them on the Goto Islands. Eric showed the map earlier. They're far south. They're actually between Japan and the Korean Peninsula, or the island of Kyushu, the southernmost island, if we aren't counting Okinawa. But you know, something that struck me is in knowing the people, first of all, that they were using Portuguese. So in their prayers, there were a lot of Portuguese words within the Japanese, and at times they themselves didn't really didn't know the meanings. They were using the word for Bethlehem, you know, Belém, in you know, the Portuguese sort of Japanized. And they didn't know whether this was a heavenly realm or where it was, but it was sacred no matter what. I first heard stories from them, and then I found out that there actually were 10 manuscripts that had been collected that were dated from 1822 to 1926 that were loosely called, well, they were called the beginning of heaven and earth. And they were actually the Bible of these people. But, you know, they were an aggregate of stories. I guess you could say that about the Bible as well. But and then there were certain figures that were prominent. And I have to say right away, one of the most prominent figure is actually Mary, the mother of Jesus. And that really captured my imagination there. I thought, well, you know, the Marian tradition was obviously very strong amongst the Jesuits, amongst the Dominicans and the Augustinians, Franciscans. They were all at work, but the Jesuits were really the first missionaries there in Japan. That's starting from 1549 when Francis Xavier arrived. But there was a huge linguistic problem, and I think we're all kind of talking about that. It's a huge challenge. It was a huge challenge for the mission. They had only one person who had committed a crime in Japan, and he was really they met him on board a ship, and they brought him back. He converted. He was so desperate, so he became. They decided, he converted and we can train him. So he became really the first translator. And, you know, it's interesting because his background was a kind of tantric Buddhist background. He was a Shingon Buddhist. So he, kind of carried that with him. When he translated, he was translating God as Mahavarashana, or in Japanese, Dainichi. So anyway, he, they went with him for a while until they realized that the problem was that Japanese were thinking this was some kind of Christianity, was some form of Buddhism, and they didn't want that kind of syncretism. That's the one thing they wanted to avoid. So translation in the early mission was the hugest conundrum for them. And at first, they tried to translate words. They tried to find an equivalent. They couldn't find it. And finally, the person who replaced Xavier said, no, we cannot, Balthazar Gago. He said, we cannot translate. We have to keep words as is. Okay, so we'll use the Portuguese words, we'll use the Latin words. And they kind of favored the Latin words at first, until one of the most fluent, ultimately, finally, they started getting more fluency in the Jesuit mission. decided, no, let's go with the Portuguese words instead. They're closer to Japanese, the way they sound. And so you get this sprinkling of Portuguese words in prayers. Now, I heard it, directly with the hidden Christians that I knew, but I was only later to discover in the Hidden Christian Bible that the whole Bible was sprinkled with these words, because as much as they tried to translate, well, at least books of the Bible initially, the Bible wasn't actually translated. There was not a translation of the whole Bible till 1880 or 1887, Old and New Testament. New Testament came first, then the Old Testament. So what happened in Japan there was a terrible persecution. And that was in the 17th century. And with that persecution, you got the destruction of the Christian churches, the Catholic churches that had been built. You got the deportation of the missionaries, and you got this huge orphaned community. They were, enthusiastically involved with their padres. And and this is, I'm talking now, by 1640, there was that deportation. There were perhaps some hidden missionaries at work. It's unclear, and for how long that lasted. But so in this period, from the persecution or the deportation, 1640 to 19th century, basically, late 1800s, you get an isolated folk who's trying to remember their traditions in some way. So there were many stories told and not written down till pretty late. Actually, as I mentioned, the 10 manuscripts we have that became the beginning of Heaven and Earth date from 1822 to 1926. So I did translate the cleanest, the best manuscript. And of course, I could consult with hidden Christians, but by then the text was kind of distant from them, which raises an interesting question of why was it ever written down? Because anything Christian, whether it was a cross or a statue or any kind of a book that had any Christian symbolism or prayers, that would cost you your life. And so, but there were these copies that were hidden, that eventually did come to the surface. So I chose one story from this text, which was a story about Mary and a king called the King of Luzon. And the King of Luzon, it's referring to Luzon in the Philippines. The Japanese had a lot of trade with the Philippines, and there were Spanish ships that were going from the Philippines to Mexico, and they were stopping in Japan. So you had this kind of, this kind of traffic. The story goes like this, more or less. So the king wants a bride. Okay, it's very, very much like a fairy tale story. The king wants a bride. He wants a suitable bride. He gets wind of this girl, this young girl, Mary, or she's called Maruya. And he says, I want you to be my wife. And she says, oh, no, I have a vow of chastity, and I cannot marry. And he says, please marry me. I'll give you anything. And she says, I can't. And she doesn't know what to do at this point. So she begins to pray. And she looks heavenward. And then down from the heavens comes a little, what you would see on a Buddhist altar, a Shinto altar, a small little tray, but it's laden with foods. And it's what you would place before a deity. This tray comes down to her. And and the king says, she looks at the king, but the king says, no, it's not good enough. I need more proof than that. And so she looks heavenward again, she prays, and then it begins to snow. It's August, it begins to snow. and everyone starts getting very, very cold and shivering. The king is, well, he's scared, but he's still not convinced. And so she looks up one more time to heaven, and a flower cart comes down, and it picks her up on the flower cart, and she ascends into heaven. Now, in heaven, she meets with God, and God gives her a title. He gives her a title, and he gives her a new name. And her name, it becomes Yukino Santa Maria, which is Our Lady of the Snows, which refers to an ancient legend in Italy, where there was a miracle of snow falling, and a beautiful basilica was built on that spot. So you can see, from this, legends had been remembered. Bible had never been translated. And so they cherished whatever pieces they had and elaborated on them, because Japanese folktale tradition has this motif of a celestial or divine woman who marries a mortal man. These are always unequal marriages. And so you have that going on. Later, we find out that the king has died. He's been so shocked by this experience. And then this character Maruya, the angel Gabriel appears to her, and then a butterfly with the annunciation that she will give birth to a savior, and a butterfly flies into her mouth. She gives birth later, but the parents disown her. Okay, her parents are ashamed of her. They say, you're unmarried, you're pregnant, that's it. You rejected the king, you've embarrassed us, you've humiliated us. And so that's basically that little sort of vignette about Mary. I give you that one story from the Hidden Christian Bible, but I wanted to juxtapose it with a very different kind of example that's outside of the Hidden Christian story. And so I thought there's a more modern legend that is about the tomb of Christ, which is supposedly in the north of Japan, in a small town called Shingo in Aomori. And this is like 1936. There was a claim that it had been discovered, that it was on top of a hill. And it wasn't announced publicly until 1960. By 1964, you get numbers start rising of all the people who are going to see this tomb. In 1964 too, you get the beginning of a Christ festival there in this town, and where you have dances in Christ's honor in a language that's, some form of glossolalia. It's claimed to be an ancient language from the Middle East. And then the story gets a little bit more elaborated with what's interesting is that people from the community are adding pieces. So the first version of the story was that Christ had not been crucified at all, and that he had come to Japan actually when he was 21 as some kind of an exchange student. He had gone back at age 33. And then he was condemned. He was condemned for heresy because he spoke of the greatness of this nation of Japan. And so he escaped, and his brother was crucified in his place. And so what this Christ figure takes, he returns to Japan again because his life is, endangered. So he cuts the ear off of his brother, one of his ears, and he takes a lock of his mother's hair, and he returns to Japan. He returns to this small village, Shingo, He gets married, he farms, he has 3 daughters. He lives to be 106. He's leading a very ordinary life, and the town claims to have his descendants. And so this is a very interesting story given its time in history. So first of all, during the Pacific War in the 36, when the tomb was first discovered, but also the fact that during the post-war years when Japan was occupied by American military, that was 7 years in which Japan was getting totally bombarded with American culture. And, trying to know who they were, trying to stay afloat, trying to be Shinto or whatever, taking this Christ figure and Japanizing him, that it was Japan that he learned everything from, was really a way of dealing with this incredible inundation, cultural inundation. So these are really the 2 examples that I discuss in depth. It's too complicated, all of the ins and outs of the story, but and I don't want to be tell you too much now, but these are the 2 examples, and they are examples of folklore, I think, created under the pressure of a real threat to the sense of religious and cultural identity, and they both arise, in different settings. And so I wanted to show these 2 very different examples from different historical periods, because I don't want to put folklore as something in the past. I want to show how it's living and growing. And I feel this all the time, because this experience really woke me up to folklore in my midst, where I am now. And I don't want to pull my example too far afield, but I will say that I noticed in my area, we have these huge silhouettes of Bigfoot. I don't know whether you see them around. And at first I thought, people didn't take down their Halloween decorations. But then they went on past Christmas, and then they're going on the whole year. And then I realized, oh no, this is folklore in the making, really. There is a need to bring Bigfoot out now, and Bigfoot has meaning for people. And so I just say that because I watched this folklore in the making in the 1990s, when 20,000 people started descending upon this little town. And it seemed like every few years there was another piece of the story that was getting added. And so as an anthropologist, I was trained in W.B. Tyler and James Frazier, at least in part. And I guess I want to say that in response to that sort of evolutionary idea, or that it's a folklore as a remnant of the past, or a vestige, that it's a very creative thing, and it's a necessity for people. It's a beautiful thing. Eric, you mentioned earlier about film, and I think that's the perfect, folklore and film. And I'd say that is the place to start doing new folkloric research, is in, say, anime or in manga. And you've shown the manga, exactly, that's what's happening. So it's a dynamic force. I think we need to see it in that creative light. And that's essentially what I learned from my work with both of these legends, because I spent time also in Shingo talking to people, and they have a small museum where now they're trying to prove, look at the clothes in contemporary, Palestine. Look, they're like our farmers' clothes. So making, showing, trying to make these connections of an ancient link between Japan between Christ and Japan. And, you know, it's interesting. Well, yes, you know, well, put it this way, most of the press that comes out about this Shingo story is very negative. Everyone says this is a hoax. But I think that idea that it's a hoax, it misses the whole point of why do people create a story? What is it serving? Who's it serving? You know, and I think it would be a bit crude to say it's just for touristic purposes, you know, just, you know, a backwater town wants to raise some money. I think it's a lot deeper than that. And I will leave us some time to talk because we don't have much time. So thank you.
No, thank you so much. And thank you so much for making that point about folklore, bringing it up to the present and it being something that's living and continuing. And I just two real quick footnotes to what you just said. One is here in Easton, if you drive south along the Delaware River, along 611, there's an old and very well-known in the area place that makes concrete statuary for, you know, lawn ornaments, you know, statues of Mary and statues of every kind of animal you can imagine. But as you drive along, they have all their wares, you know, on display. But there's a huge, you know, over 6 foot statue of Sasquatch you know, lurching out toward the road. I mean, the first time they put it out there, I almost drove off the road to, you know, swerving out of the way because I thought he was stepping in front of my car. The other thing I just wanted to ask before we go to some questions I have for all of you, I just wanted, given that Crystal did take some time to talk about the Shingo tomb of Jesus in Shingo, I wondered, Herman, did you want to say a couple of things about the tomb of Jesus in Srinagar?
I mean, I've done a little bit of investigating, but I think Crystal's given me some ideas now, actually, how to approach it. I hadn't really looked that much into it. Although one idea, which is a little bit to the side, a fascinating book, and Eric, if you're looking for another project for tombs of Jesus throughout the world, there must be countless. But I think it's the same thing. I mean, I agree with Chris on this. It's not a bunch of people trying to, you know, make a tourist site. There is probably elements, and the likelihood is there was someone there. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily to think Jesus, but you know, the legend gets accretions, and at some point it took a turn, whether asserting something during a war, asserting something during a difficult period. And I think this is a great, you know, sort of a great lead into the way in which the Bible gets used. You know, it's a really interesting reception element. So it's terrific.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me reading the essays that, you know, in both of yours, you bring up these two different tombs. I talk about it a little bit in my own, and refer to yours, your discussions, but it's so interesting how, you know, I think I mentioned this in my opening remarks. I mean, one of my interests is in just the mobility of Jesus as a folkloric character. I mean, he get all the incredible lore about his travels, extensive travels and studies in India, and then he comes back later in some of the accounts after he escapes crucifixion. I mean, that the escape from crucifixion, which of course is the Islamic account as well, that he doesn't actually die on the cross, that gets into so many of these folkloric traditions. But you have him going to India, all over Tibet. There are stories of his going, as you say, as a kind of exchange student to Japan. I love that comparison. Stories of his going up to England. There are arguments that travels to Africa have been suppressed, you know, and that's one of the most fascinating dimensions of all this. But let me just put a question out there, or actually I'll combine two questions to all of you. And I want to really thank all four of you for your really rich presentations. What in doing your research for your essays for this volume on the folkloric reception of the Bible in your various regions that you explored, what did you find to be, as scholars, the greatest challenge in how to to get at this, and also what did you find most surprising, and in as an extension of to that question, what do you think your readers might find most surprising about what you found and what you discussed?
I found, having got used to the idea of textuality and sacred texts and reading books in order to know religion and study it and talk about it, I was very struck by going back to Zimbabwe for my teaching profession and finding that I needed to be more anthropological in order to actually find out what was going on when it comes to this subject. And honestly, it really hit me one day. I woke up at night worrying about something, looked at a beautiful moonlight, then I heard music, people singing, talking, and I said, sounds peaceful. And then I decided to walk over and I noticed, wow, this is folklore going on, a dramatization of knowledge where you imagine the religious vocabulary is actually translated into action in ways that a scholar wouldn't normally think about. So I found that an interesting challenge, but I took it on because it was interesting enough for me. But I'm struck by the stories here very much in terms of this welcoming reception of Christianity, and the others where it's kind of mixed or even negative. That's kind of interesting way through which, through folklore, you actually get to a deeper knowledge of the culture's reception of the religion in question. So, yeah.
For me, there was and it always remains with the study of India, it's a linguistic challenge. You just need so many languages and then access to the material. So that was the challenge. But I, on the other side of it, and where I was continued to be surprised, is the amount of materials that were collected by missionaries. And when John was showing those pictures, I know a lot was destroyed in China. So I'm guessing that was out of a missionary archive. The missionary archives, I mean, now so much of it is digitized and is available, but there must be, I mean, vast, and they're collected in various places. So it's that opens up a route for scholarship. I don't know too many people who spend that much time in those archives. I think they're probably difficult to work through, but there's a real source there for scholars.
Yeah. That's where I began, actually, sitting. Then I found a colonial records accounting missionary activities. And then suddenly it came up that there was a problem to do with these people being seen in spaces they shouldn't be, in urban areas, because they were not working, but they were dressed in white, they were talking. And the suspicion was that it was political, that there was something going on political, and then the difficulty was to understand what they were actually saying. And Johannes Masowe was arrested, by the way, and he almost, the stories about him echo a Jesus, an African Jesus. It led to debates among scholars, so because he was of the way he was conducting his affairs in that. So it was recorded in an archive that there was these people who are not given authority by missionaries to preach, but they seem to be doing so, and somebody needs to investigate. So the police were sent and he was arrested for 3 days, and they start to write stories about him. So these are actually stories of a gospel of God is called, surrounding the founder of the movement, because they gave him a persecution complex and actually aided him. He had visions of God and so on, of God telling him to go and speak to the people. He's said to have died 8 times, so he beats Jesus on dying and rising because he would go unconscious for a few days and then come up again, and the people started to follow him like that. And his tomb is kept. There was a debate about what to do with him after he died. They buried him at a tomb site, which is now a place of pilgrimage for thousands of these white-robed people. They go and they pray and they.
The literature, any record of it is they're actually in missionary archives. It's not, or it's in the colonial archive as well.
Well, the Jesuit, actually, I'm glad I heard Jesuit several times. The Catholic have their own archives, so they keep their own stuff. But this was in the general kind of colonial archive, because they were seen in. They were disturbing the peace of the colonial landscaping and stuff like that. So they were, it was like a study to show a warning about them. At the time, no one thought it was religious, but it gave me the idea to try and look around myself to see if I could see any evidence. But Clive Dillon Malone was a Jesuit Catholic. And it's interesting, he wrote the first book on it's really very good, called The Corsten Basket Makers, because he too made the connection between the social change and the rise of this movement. It's a fantastic book, actually. It's good.
Yeah, I think for me, just like other colleagues, the immensity of these materials in missionary archives, both Protestant missionary archives and also Jesuit missionary archives, are tremendous. I mean, so how to select and how through all the relevant materials, this is one of the major challenges. But at the same time, the scarcity of primary materials in the folkloric traditions is also a challenge. I mean, so how to get, more verbal kind of oral traditions, to be incorporated, this is also a challenge. But having said that, I mean, there are some materials that we might further, investigate. For example, looking into other religious traditions, just as I said, in the Taoist tradition. So actually, they have included some narratives or folkloric imaginations of Jesus, and also maybe Virgin Mary. Actually, Virgin Mary was portrayed as a kind of Taoist immortal in some Taoist collections of immortals, Taoist collection of immortals, and Virgin Mary was incorporated. So I think these are fascinating materials that we can further investigate. And what's most fascinating and surprising, I mean, maybe for the readers, is the multifaceted images of Jesus. For example, I've just said Jesus was portrayed as a swine. And actually, swine has a kind of folkloric connotation of sex, fertility, and also maybe adultery. So Jesus has this very negative and pejorative, image. But at the same time, Jesus have a very reputable image in the Taoist tradition as a Taoist immortal. So you see these very extreme kind of images of Jesus in anti-Christian traditions, but at the same time in other indigenous religious traditions. This might be very surprising for the readers. Yeah, thank you.
I'm finding in contemporary America that this generation of the students I teach now, once you mention myth or folklore and you're teaching religion, they really get very upset because the general misconception that it's false. It can't be true. In fact, a myth means it's a lie to some of them. So one has to kind of cautiously bring this up as a. So I just work quietly on it, but as I teach. But when I tell them that there is mythology found in the Bible, meaning stories you read that have a deeper meaning, which you must think about upon reading, not just kind of take literally. But one thing that strikes me actually also as a challenge is that we have orality as part of Christianity, the practice thereof anyway. People sing, they close their eyes, they're subconsciously internalized the kind of ways that could be put together as folkloric in the practice of Christianity, as well as combining it with the textuality. So we're living in a modern world in which we have both, I think, to look at. In my town at Christmas, that shows how things are going kind of strange. They had this last Christmas, and I counted the days. I went for my early morning walk, and I still found these Christmas lights lit at 6 a.m. From December, from early December until the end of February. And I was thinking, is this about Santa Claus? Or is it about just Christianity and Jesus being born because something went wrong there in the city council's religious imagination? They kept the lights on, and we were paying tax for it. So I enjoy looking at my surroundings for telltale signs of the fact that we really need to keep studying these things.
Just one a question popped up on the screen from in the chat from Andy, and it is, I have a possible question for John. Is there any truth to the theory that the Virgin Mary had an influence on the way that the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, that the Avalokitesvara's gender changed from male to female Kuan Yin, Japanese kanon, as it moved east? I encountered this theory once. Virgin Mary as a goddess of compassion reappears in China as Kuan Yin. And I actually, Crystal touches on that in her essay. But John, did you want to address that at all? The gender change that occurs and
Okay, that's a fascinating question.
Yes.
Yeah, Guan Yin, actually, the goddess of mercy, has a gender changed from male to female in China. But interestingly, I think Virgin Mary has a lot of echo to Guan Yin, this figure. I think in especially in Japan, right, where during the prohibition of Catholicism, right? I think any hidden Christians, they actually worship Virgin Mary with the disguise of worshiping this Guan Yin figure, right? I think in China, during the prohibition of Christianity in the 18th century, when all the Jesuits got kicked out of China, during that time, actually, many hidden Catholics in China, they might have this same tradition of worshiping Virgin Mary under the disguise of like worshiping the Buddhist figure, Guan Yin. I think there's a kind of similarity there. But what I've just said is that in the Taoist tradition, actually, they've also incorporated Virgin Mary into their pantheon. So that's a very interesting, I think, kind of point that in different religious traditions, this kind of motherly figure or the figure of goddess of mercy and compassion is very kind of, there's a commonality there.
Yeah.
That's why I think both the Buddhist traditions, the Taoist traditions, and also Catholic traditions would highlight that and then bring them together. And as I mentioned, in the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, they also emphasize the importance of the female figure in their heavenly kind of realm and heavenly pantheon. Yeah. So we see, I mean, this commonality. Yeah.
In the Shona religious language of the Masoe, Mwari is associated with the kind of as the source of life. I think that's what the attribute that comes first to mind. So the women's fertility is tied to actually God himself. And Johanne Masoe bordered on suggesting that his real father was actually in prison at the time his mother became pregnant and with child. So there are all these stories of virgin births that are very interesting to find across religious traditions. It's interesting. So Mary is, I'm fascinated by your story. I'd love to see more about that, just to I can learn.
Yeah, on that note, we've reached the top of the hour.
Okay.
Mary, as you say, Mary and Jesus, looking at this volume as a whole, the second volume of this handbook, I can assure viewers and everyone that Mary and Jesus are almost like competing figures in the way that they appear transformed in each of the cultures that each of you have written about and others as well in the volume. It's just fascinating. I failed to mention earlier, by the way, that Jesus also, of course, we have an essay on the reception of the Bible in Latter-day Saint folklore, and of course Jesus appears in goes on in ministry in the New World in the according to the sacred scriptures of the and the folklore as well of the Latter-day Saints. Listen, there's so much more. I think that if this panel has done anything to whet the appetites for the viewers to go out and get hold of the 2 volumes of this, again, this is the first volume, the Bible in Folklore Worldwide, and the second volume, as I say, will be out in November. And you've heard the presentations by our wonderful 4 panelists this morning, and you get an idea of what's in the volume. There's a lot more, believe me, and I hope that it's triggered some interest among you. Thank you so much, Bella, John, Herman, and also Crystal, even though Crystal has disappeared off the screen, and Andy, for the festival and for allowing us, giving us this venue to share our excitement about this project. Thanks so much.
Well,
thank you, Eric. Yeah, and Andy. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for checking in with the Easton Book Festival. We are sponsored by Lafayette College, the Greater Easton Development Partnership, and many other sponsors. And we'll see you at another festival session. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.